Hey everyone, welcome to the second video for chapter 31, and in this video we're going to be talking about African independence. So let's look at a map first. Alright, this map shows the year that all of the countries of Africa gained their independence. Now remember, the entire continent was conquered by European powers by the year 1900s, with two exceptions. Alright, Ethiopia, you see that one's historically independent, and Liberia. Okay, Liberia and Ethiopia were the only two that were still independent by the beginning of the 20th century. The rest of them all gained their independence at different times. Now you notice that most of them were around the year 1960. 1960 itself was a big one, right? Niger, Chad, Nigeria, Central African Republic, and then, the early 60s, Zambia, Botswana, Kenya, Tanzania, and so forth. And then, there were some other ones that came about in the 70s and even Namibia in 1990. But it kind of started to happen fairly quickly after World War II. The momentum picked up steam as international pressure against Europeans to give up their colonies increased. And by the 60s, the majority of Africa was becoming independent from European control. Now, these nations would face significant challenges, though. Let's look at a couple of them. A major problem faced by several African nations after independence was that of unity. We kind of have a stereotype of Africa as being, just one ethnicity, that if you're from Africa, you're just African. And that is way, way off from the truth. Africa has tremendous ethnic diversity. Here you see a map that the black outlines are the modern political borders of the nations. And then within, you have the colors represent all the different ethnicities. So look at the Democratic Republic of Congo, for instance. Okay, this big one here in the center. It's a patchwork. There's tons of different ethnicities in here. And that creates an issue. The borders of these new nations were not formed by the African peoples themselves. They were formed by the Europeans when they left. They often did not take into account that they were creating conflicts with ethnic rivalries. Some of these ethnic groups had been in conflict for generations, and now they were told that you guys have to vote in the same election and be on the same Olympic team and wave the same flag. It's not really going to happen. It's not always going to work out well. Another common problem was with governments. You have an awful lot of dictators. Some of the most notorious dictators in history, such as Idi Amin, who was a leader in Uganda. Several independence leaders decided that they would capitalize on their popularity by giving themselves basically unlimited power. They often justified this by saying that they were doing it to ensure stability and unity. Unity, as I said, was a big, big problem. The reality was that they became dictators, and many created very, very corrupt and repressive governments. This often leads to anger with the government, and it often follows with a coup d'etat. Coup d'etat is a forcible overthrow of a government. Now, a final issue that you see here is international interference. Most African nations were not economically independent, meaning that they had to rely on businesses with the developed world, United States, China, Great Britain, Japan, etc. That also means that they often had to give up control over domestic businesses, industries, and resources. So while many African nations are very rich in natural resources, the countries themselves and the people themselves don't have access to them. All right, let's do a couple of case studies here. We're going to be looking at 5 African nations and how they moved from being colonies to independence. The first is Ghana. Ghana is a small West African nation that was one of the few to gain independence before 1960. It was referred to as the Gold Coast when it was a British colony, and it was valuable for its gold, obviously, and other mineral resources. The independence movement was led by this guy, Kwame Nkrumah. Nkrumah led Ghana in a peaceful independence movement and implemented socialist policies run by the government. He put forth a lot of big projects that resulted in the country going into massive debt, though. His government became more dictatorial in style, and he was overthrown by a coup in 1966. The cycle repeated itself over several times until the 1990s. You had military dictators and things like that. Finally, by the late 20th century, a more democratic government was finally put in place. All right, now Kenya. Let me move me down here so you can see on the map. Kenya was a valuable land in terms of agriculture. It was also a British colony. Both Ghana and Kenya were controlled by the British. And you had an awful lot of European settlers that moved there. And after they moved there, they created laws to ensure that they would remain at the top of the food chain. This led to an armed struggle between African nationalists and white settlers. This was known as the Mau Mau Uprising. The term Mau Mau comes from a British name given to the local Kikuyu people. Even though, now this was a fairly violent struggle between between white settlers and black nationalists. The British government got involved with it, and it got pretty violent. Even though he distanced himself from the Mau Mau, the leader of this independence movement was this gentleman known as Jomo Kenyatta. Kenyatta was elected as Kenya's first president in 1964, but he and his successors became known for strongman policies like limiting freedom of speech and controlling elections. Again, we're seeing a trend here of moving from democratic beginnings to more dictatorial styles once they get in power. And this atmosphere of corruption has hurt Kenya to this day. Algeria. Algeria is in North Africa. All right, here you have it here along the Mediterranean coast with Morocco, Libya, and Egypt. Ethnically very different. It's mostly Arab. It's not, North African countries ethnically are very different from sub-Saharan African countries. And it was similar to Kenya in that it had numerous white settlers. However, the white settlers were French. Okay, this was a French colony, not a British colony. And this kind of, struggle between Algerian nationalists and white settlers also resulted in armed conflict, and it was kind of spearheaded on the Algerian side by the National Liberation Front. The National Liberation Front turned this into a guerrilla warfare. Now, they were able to win, mostly because France was kind of worn out from not only World War II, but also from fighting in Vietnam, which we talked about in a previous chapter. But after gaining independence in 1962, Algeria experienced internal conflict, and it struggled to keep out foreign control of its resources. The late 20th century saw conflict also between the government and Islamists. Islamists are Muslims who want a government based on Islamic law or Sharia law. And this eventually led to civil war between Islamists and the government in the 1990s. Kind of more extreme Islamic ideology is something we're going to be talking about over the next couple of chapters. The Democratic Republic of the Congo. This is a large Central African nation. It is very, very rich in natural resources. It's also, ironically, usually at the very top of the world's poorest countries. Here you have the DR Congo, GDP per capita, per growth. Some lists will have it number 2, many number 1. In any event, it is very, very poor. And you think, how is it possible that a country that is so rich in natural resources is so poor? Well, a lot of it had to do was because of exploitations and the history of it. This was a Belgian Congo. I remember we talked about this in the chapter on imperialism. And even after independence, the Belgians wanted to maintain control over the natural resources. That meant that they did very little to help Congo transition to independence, resulting in a nation that was really unprepared for independence. Like most other African nations, it is very ethnically diverse with over 200 separate groups, and ethnic rivalries and competition for resources led to constant conflict until power was eventually claimed by this guy, Joseph Mobutu. And Mobutu ruled for 32 years, again, as a dictator, and it was characterized by harsh and corrupt tactics. All right, final one, Nigeria. Nigeria, you can see it here. West African country, and it also has Africa's largest population, more so even than South Africa. It has very, very large expanding urban centers. Very ethnically diverse. All right, over 250 ethnic groups that you got. Plus, there are religious divisions between the South, which is mostly Christian, and the North, which is mostly Muslim. The Muslim North has gained notoriety in recent years with the rise of Islamic groups such as Boko Haram. They want to implement Sharia law, and they have given support for international terrorist organizations such as ISIS and Al-Qaeda. They've also engaged in terrorist activities themselves, such as mass kidnappings a couple of years ago when they went into a Catholic school and kidnapped a group of girls and forced them into, they said, be their wives, but really it was a form of slavery. All right. To make matters worse, oil was discovered. Now, you think oil should be a good thing, but the hopes that it would lead to economic prosperity were dashed, and unfortunately, it's only led to more conflict. All right. Civil war and eventually military rule. Nigerians resented the environmental damage that oil drilling was doing, while only foreign businesses were seeing profits. And so, again, this led to regional conflict and civil war where the military and the government had to step in. So a trend that you're seeing in Africa is that rich in natural resources, but high levels of corruption in government, high levels of inefficiency, high levels of foreign interference for exploitation, and an inability for many of these countries to really stand on their own 2 feet. All right, so that wraps it up for Africa. And in the next and final video for this chapter, we'll talk about the modern Middle East.